Hello everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Accelerated Regulatory Approval in 2022 and Beyond, Managing Uncertainty with the Impact of Brexit and COVID. I'm Olivia Seifert and I'm the editor of the Evidence Base, and I'll be your host for today's event. Before I introduce you to our speakers, I'd like to quickly cover a few housekeeping items. All the widgets are resizable and movable, so please feel free to move them around and maximize your slide area to full screen to get the most out of your desktop space. Some networks cause slides to advance more slowly than others, so logging off your VPN is recommended. If your slides are behind, pushing F5 on your keyboard will refresh the page. A copy of today's slide deck and our feedback survey are located in the resource list, but we encourage you to download any resources or links that you may find useful. An on-demand version of today's webinar will be available approximately 1 hour after the webinar has ended and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Please let us know your thoughts on today's webinar by tweeting us at the EviBase or by using the hashtag EVBWebinars, or simply share today's webinar with your friends and colleagues using the Share This Widget button on your screen. I'm delighted to introduce our chair for today, Martin Strandberg Larsen. Martin is a life science leader with a passion for market access and health economics to bring new innovations to patients. He has worked in the pharmaceutical and medtech industries since 2008, and he has experience as a global and regional lead and currently is focused on precision medicine in oncology and pulmonology. As senior director of market access at Verisight and previously AstraZeneca. He holds a doctoral degree in health sciences from the University of Copenhagen. And I'd now like to introduce you to today's speakers. Firstly, we're joined by Leslie Galloway, who was elected as chairman of EMIG in 2005 and has been instrumental in its metamorphosis from its origins as a business and networking group to the influential trade association that it is today. In July 2014, Leslie was elected as Vice President of the European Confederation of Pharmaceutical Entrepreneurs and appointed to the board of the European Union Medical Cannabis Association in 2019. Leslie was also Vice Chairman of the NICE Project Development Group for Local Formularies Good Practice Guidance, is a member of the NICE Medicines Optimization Guidance Development Group, and is currently an expert advisor to the NICE Centre for Clinical Practice. In April 2020, Leslie became co-founder and chairman of Tetris Pharma Ltd. Additionally, I'd like to welcome Skip Olsen. Skip is currently the Global Head of Integrated Evidence Strategy and Innovation at Novartis. As such, he is responsible for promoting the very best in research methodology and applications of real-world evidence and other evidence across all therapeutic areas and around the globe to drive better decision-making. He comes from a background in health economics and outcomes research, where he has led the use of RWE to transform the generation of patient insights and value for money assessments. He earned a Doctor of Science in Biostatistics from Harvard University and has worked in the pharmaceutical industry for nearly 30 years. Thank you all so much for joining today. And I'd now like to pass over to Martin to begin the discussion of this panel's agenda. Martin, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you everyone for joining on this particularly hot day in Europe, if you're based there. We have a very busy agenda with some very important and critical questions that are highly important at the moment. And I'm actually going to start right off with the first topic. And this is how regulators have typically handled areas of unmet need. And I would like to pass this question to Leslie. And before I do that, please, if you have questions along the way, you are free to type them in the Q&A function. And then we will make sure to cover as many questions as we can towards the end of the session. But the first topic, Leslie, how have regulators actually handled areas of unmet need traditionally?
Thank you, Martin. Well, when talking about unmet need and accelerated regulatory approval, it's important to talk about three things. First of all, the accelerated access to medicine scheme, EAMS, Project Orbis, and the innovative licensing and access pathway. First of all, to talk about EAMS, it's hard to believe EAMS was launched almost 8 years ago, and it's proven very, very popular in the UK with industry. EAMS gives patients with life-threatening or seriously debilitating conditions access to medicines that don't yet have an MA, and importantly, when there is a clear unmet medical need. Under the scheme, the MHRA will give a scientific opinion on the benefit-risk balance of the medicine based on the data available when the EAMS submission was made. The opinion lasts for a year and can be renewed, but the scheme is voluntary, and the opinion from the MHRA does not replace the normal licensing procedures for medicines. Scientific opinion will be provided after a two-step evaluation process. First is PIM, or the Promising Innovative Medicine designation, and secondly, the Early Access to Medicine scientific opinion. So if we look at the PIM designation first, it will give an indication that a product may be eligible for EAMS based on early clinical data. The designation will be issued after an MHRA scientific meeting and can be given several years before licensing. The scientific opinion describes the risks and benefits of the medicine based on data gathered from the patients who will benefit from the medicine. The opinion supports the prescriber and the patient to decide on whether to use the medicine before license is approved. And as I say, it's proved very popular in the UK. If there's one downside to EAMS, it's that companies do not get paid for their medicines. And then we move to Project Orbis. And Project Orbis is specifically for oncology products only. It provides a framework, an international framework for concurrent submission and review of oncology products among international partners, and aims to deliver faster patient access to innovative cancer treatments that have potential benefits over existing therapies. Orbis is coordinated by the US FDA, and alongside the MHRA, it involves the regulatory authorities of 5 countries: Australia, Brazil, Canada, Singapore, and Switzerland. Now, Orbis partner countries may propose products for inclusion in the scheme, but each country remains fully independent on their final regulatory decisions. If we look at the products that are eligible, those with new marketing authorizations or new indication applications, but as I said before, for oncology products only. Authorizations will be applicable in the UK to GB, that is Great Britain only, not Northern Ireland, as oncology medicinal products fall within the mandatory scope of the EMA centralized procedure, which applies in Northern Ireland. The FDA coordinates the selection of products that will be included, and submissions will only be forwarded to the FDA if they meet the qualifying criteria for ILAP, the innovation passport within ILAP, that is. Before I get to ILAP, MHRA, NICE, and SMC in Scotland are collaborating with the Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway. So the aim of ILAP is to accelerate patient access to medicines. These include NCEs, biological medicines, new indications, and even repurposed medicines. The criteria for these medicines are twofold. The condition has to be life-threatening or seriously debilitating, and there is a significant patient or public health need. Horizon scanning and regulatory science will ensure that the pathway remains at the forefront of cutting-edge developments, and that it has the framework to develop evidence-based practice as new technologies and methods emerge. ILAP is open to both commercial and non-commercial developers of medicines, whether they're based in the UK or globally. As mentioned, ILAP comprises of the Innovation Passport designation, but also a target development profile, which provides applicants with access to a toolkit to support all stages of the design, development, and approvals process. It also provides opportunities for enhanced regulatory and other stakeholder input. So there's an awful lot of help for companies in all 3 of those projects. All 3 of these initiatives have proven very, very helpful in the UK. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Leslie. And of course, we're going to speak mostly about the UK today, which is the topic, but we're also going to parallel this to what's happening in other markets. Skip, do you have anything to add to this topic around unmet need?
Yeah, I mean, everyone talks about unmet need. How large is the unmet need? what kind of population, and we give special, consideration to disease areas where there really is a large unmet need, usually combined with, is it also a rare disease? Okay, so, how many patients are actually involved here? And, Leslie has really nicely outlined how things work in the UK. And some of these are new, and some of these should be opening up ways for movement more in the future, where we haven't really seen how these are really going to play out. I think we're very optimistic, and certainly in a kind of a post-Brexit phase in the UK, hopefully this will distinguish the UK from the EU and say, hey, look, we're an innovative place, things can go quickly here, and this is the sort of regulatory freedom that has been promised through Brexit. I think it's a little bit too early to say yet whether or not that kind of will be achieved, but I think things are in place and moving in the right direction. So as long as the momentum stays the way it is, it should actually play out. If we look at the FDA, I think especially over the last few months or last year or so, accelerated approval has been also, it has taken a couple of steps back. And this through one of the, spotlight approvals on Aduhelm for Alzheimer's, where lots of things happened. Okay, I won't say rightly, wrongly, or whatever, but lots of things happened. And the trust in the accelerated approval has somehow diminished. Pharma companies are a little bit reluctant, should I really go forward with this? Is it really going to help me? How is it going to help me, etc.? So I think there was a little bit of skepticism. There was even an article today in the Pink Sheet that, sort of questions what's the future of the accelerated pathway, in the US. The FDA says that it will continue. They will continue to exercise the right, rarely, but they will continue to exercise the right to introduce an accelerated pathway designation in the middle of a program like they did with Aduhelm. So they're sticking behind what they say and say, we're going to continue to do this if the data are, sufficient enough to warrant it. So I think the regulators have been trying to point out ways in certain circumstances where we can really bring innovation quickly. Where we end up getting caught a lot of times is more around, okay, if the data, if the evidence that's brought to the regulators is deemed sufficient to get the accelerated approval, then the question is, what happens then? What needs to be collected after that accelerated approval? In what time frame? And who's responsible for delivering that evidence? Is it purely up to the sponsor? Is it some kind of a joint collaboration? And I get the feeling that with whichever agency we're talking about, a lot of the question comes down to who opens first, who lays their cards on the table first? How do you really interact with this kind of a collaboration, this kind of a deal on what's the package that's required after such a sort of accelerated approval? And I think these are some of the real issues behind whether a program and approval like this is really a success or a failure.
That's a very interesting point you made, Skip. And the thing is, it's all very well accelerating approval, regulatory approval, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the patient's going to have access, because it has to get through HTA. So I know that NICE is looking at that at the moment, but it's an important issue. One other point is that the NHS England have the Accelerated Access Collaborative. They are primarily focused on ATMPs and also histology independent technologies. But at the end of the day, there is so much that needs to improve to get the product right to the patient who actually needs it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think this is also why both for regulators and payers, HTA bodies, I think it's actually crucial that that both sides, both the health care system and the manufacturer of a new intervention or medicine or a health tech solution are very early on in the process are discussing the unmet need and agreeing upon the unmet need, because the value of any intervention or medicines later on will ultimately be down to whether it solves that area of unmet need. So it's always recommended, I believe, to really make sure that there's a very good understanding between the parties to target in on the specific area of unmet need, and then the value that it brings any given solution. This is also something that will guide evidence development and everything else in the framework. So the parties join forces in solving healthcare problems that are meaningful to patients in the UK or in other countries. So with that being said, and of course time is running, do you have anything to add, Skip, to that one?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on something that Leslie said. You know, the timing of everything is extremely important. Okay, so just because you get accelerated approval from the regulatory point of view, if that's not also aligned, and this is what you were essentially saying, Leslie, if that's not aligned with the reimbursement acceleration, then you don't have an alignment with the ecosystem, and then what's the good of the accelerated regulatory approval, because you haven't been able to bring things to patients. So one of the things that, you know, is good about the UK is the MHRA is open to early discussion. NICE is certainly open to early discussion, and they do have discussions between them. And this is not always the case in a lot of countries. And so it's important that any one of those partners tries to make sure that, you know, all of these three sort of, you know, sponsor, regulators, and HTA/reimbursement/payer are sitting around the table, so that there is this alignment as much as we can around the ecosystem to take full advantage of an accelerated approval.
I think that is really spot on, and of course it also highlights some of the differences between the UK. I think we have talked about it now, and I think it's very accurate that there is a lot of willingness for dialogue early on in the process. But actually, Skip, how have you found navigating the system in the UK versus other drug reimbursement pathways?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. You know, it's this sort of love-hate relationship. You know, with UK, with the NICE, you know, but the same can be said of a lot of the other systems as well. What's really strong about, you know, the UK, if we're talking about reimbursement, let's talk about NICE. You know, they have many different options for early collaboration. You know, whether it's about the method you're going to be using, the evidence you're going to be supplying, etc. So this early collaboration really gives you the chance to start shaping what's going to be required such that there were no surprises at the end. Again, it's kind of a little bit of a game, how to interact with NICE, how to do these early collaborations, you know, who goes first, who lays their cards on the table first, and industry and NICE, maybe there's a bit of an issue there. But what we like about NICE a lot, certainly from an industry point of view, is that they're open to novel approaches. They're transparent about what they expect, the methods that they refer to and accept. They're open to discussing, you know, like I said, new and novel approaches. However, some of the other agencies aren't exactly the same. And so things work, you know, one way in the UK where you know what you have to do, and there's kind of one answer, one body, one decision maker. Now, I know that it doesn't stop there, you know, and just because you get a green light from NICE doesn't mean you're actually reaching the patients, okay? But in essence, there's this one big decision board, at least at the beginning of the process. If you go to other places like Spain and Italy, there you have things that are decentralized. It's really driven by the regions. And, you know, in Spain, there are 17 regions, and you feel like you're having to do this 17 times over. They don't always have the same requirements, you know, it sort of becomes extremely difficult. France is also nice in the sense that there's one body, okay, with one decision. Now, it's a difficult hurdle to cross, but it's there. Germany, they have very difficult requirements. It's also very much like NICE in that you know the rules of the game, and whether you like them or not, you know the rules of the game. You know what you have to produce from an evidence point of view to be successful in the German market. So it's very clear. It's very down to earth. Oftentimes we disagree and don't like it. We don't have that much room for negotiating or really there's chance for early collaboration within the German system. So there are lots of similarities with other countries. There are lots of differences. And so, like I said, you know, in the UK, early collaboration, real strong point, transparency of what's expected, real strong point, and they're open to innovation and novel approaches. So I think those features of the UK reimbursement system are excellent.
Excellent. And Leslie, do you have anything to add to this one?
Yes, I do. The thing about the answer to this question is as Skip says, you know, different in different countries. If we consider the UK environment and go through the steps immediately after market authorization, and I just want to say before I talk about this, none of what I'm about to say is a criticism of NICE or NHS England, and I'll explain why at the end of what I say. First of all, we have regulatory costs to get your MA. Then we're faced with the cost of HTA itself, which is around £143,000 for a standard HTA. Very likely, companies are faced with a patient access scheme in order to become cost effective. But it doesn't stop there. Once companies get a NICE approval, a company can be faced with the NHS England affordability criteria, even if they're cost effective at the patient access scheme stage. if they're not referred for a patient access scheme, they could be faced with a managed access agreement, which in turn will require quite a big discount. Companies may be faced with therapeutic tendering. And the biggest significant individual issue that's happened this year is the voluntary scheme. The rate has gone from 5% to 15%, but the prognosis for next year is much worse. Predictions are that it will be 24, 26, possibly even 28% of a rebate. So all of those deductions on the price happen after a company's product has been found to be cost-effective. Now, I said earlier on, these are not criticisms of NICE or NHS England. And the reason for that is it's really the government. Our government, IQVIA did a lot of research over a 20-year period, and it was published at the beginning of this year. And they looked at the percentage that was spent on medicines as a percentage of total healthcare spend. And with most countries around Europe and elsewhere, it was around 15, 16, 17%. In the UK, it was 9%. So very substantially different. Then what that reflects is the amount that the government is prepared to spend on healthcare and on medicines puts organizations such as NICE and NHS England in a position where they have to drive down costs. And that puts the industry in conflict with those organizations. And it shouldn't have to be. And what my big concern is, if next year companies are faced with a 24, 26, 28% rebate after all of those other taxes, they may not launch in the UK. And that's going to be a problem for NHS England, who will be faced with not having access to new medicines. So patients may live longer in France or Germany, etc., than in the UK. It's going to be a problem for patients, particularly.
So, Leslie, I'll take this opportunity to ask you, living in the UK, something that you just touched upon with your response about, let's see what happens next year. You know, a lot of this could be thrown into question with the upcoming change of government. So are there any expected changes in the policy, perhaps, that are predicted that might come with the change of government? This is really looking into a crystal ball, you know, to figure, okay, what might happen? Are we going to stay on the same course, likely, as the UK has been so far? Or do you think that something like policies around accelerated approval or accelerated reimbursement might or could fundamentally change, or the reasons for UK as an innovative hotspot might change with the change of government?
I wish I shared your optimism. You know, I listened to the rhetoric in the UK in this election, and people talking about tax cuts. Tax cuts fund themselves. That's a well-worn track, and it isn't true. Any economist will tell you they do not work. And the reality is we have to take our medicine and cut back. So there are big challenges for the industry because cost of living, there are going to be pay demands throughout the rest of this year, and the pharmaceutical industry is going to be at the bottom of the pile. The problem is that patients will also, therefore, be at the bottom of the pile. And it's, you know, things have not changed over the last 20-odd years. The UK has been 9-10% thereabouts over the last 20 years. It's consistent. Whereas other countries around in Europe, the US, Japan, have all been 14, 15, 16, up to 18% healthcare spend has been spent on medicines. And this is something that really dramatically needs to change. So I am very concerned that it won't change, but we'll have to put pressure on the government to try to explain to them the consequences. Because if companies don't launch in the UK loses financially from that investment. The problem is that new medicines are seen as a cost instead of an investment, because companies set up in the UK, they grow, they pay taxes. It's not rocket science. So sorry if I...
Yeah. No, I'm a little bit more optimistic. Looking beyond just the taxation part of this. Healthcare was built as being a driver in the post-Brexit setting. Also with talking to my colleagues in the UK, we don't really see that there's any danger or any reason for that fundamentally to change. Now, to your point of view, that might not be enough to secure the actual investment that's needed to keep UK as a choice for investment. But there shouldn't be any reason to believe that the policy of the new government, whoever that might be, might change for the worse to make the situation worse than it is currently. But anyway.
I hope it does not. I hope they don't make it worse. But
Great.
It's. I'm an optimist, but at the moment, I've not seen a more difficult time for pharma.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think in this context, of course, it's important to discuss differences between the UK, Germany, and France, or other European countries. But I also think it's important to set the ambition right. So many of the new drugs are launched first in the US, and then only 2 years after, 3 years after, 4 years after, we will actually get to see them being launched in Europe and the UK. So I think that's also about setting the ambition right. So how can we actually accelerate getting new health interventions and new medicines to patients, especially in areas where there's no medicine alternative or a rare disease that is not well served. So I think that's the real discussion that politicians should have. How can we actually make sure that patients get access to new innovations as soon as possible? And I'm also a little bit optimistic in terms of that there's actually a path towards early value assessments, managed access schemes, and so on. And I know we'll come back to that later on in this discussion. So time is flying, so I also want to make sure we touch upon the next question, the future picture of accelerated regulatory approval, especially within rare diseases. Leslie, do you want to start first?
I wasn't going to talk about that. Well, there are a few things I would like to say. The NICE Methods Review, which I sat on for almost 3 years, has made a commitment to address uncertainty and severity. This will be a two-step severity modifier to replace end-of-life criteria, and it translates into either a £36,000 or a £51,000 maximum cost quality. One of the issues that NICE will face, actually, is that everyone's definition of what severity is may be different. So that has to be clarified. Then the issue of addressing uncertainty. This is going to be a deliberative decision for committees to talk about and agree on. They'll look at how the uncertainties have risen, the challenges in generating the evidence. But I do believe, we talked about the patient. The role of the patient in both of those issues and clinician is very, very important. And I believe there's an important opportunity for a patient and a clinician to appear at committee meetings when the decision is being made to use a product, and to actually be able to sway the decision. There is the patient access, the patient and clinician engagement in Scotland is in place, but we need something similar that works well in England. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Leslie. Skip, do you have anything to add to this one?
You know, I think for the future picture of accelerated regulatory approval, you know, for rare diseases, I think I've already touched on a lot of the points. You know, Leslie pointed out, you know, with the MHRA, there are several new pathways created. The MHRA has also been looking internationally to compare what they're doing to what is being done in other countries, with the aim of being really independent and even quicker than the EU. So I think, you know, from a UK point of view, like we mentioned earlier, it might be a little bit early to make an assessment, but, you know, the future picture should be quite good. From the FDA, you know, recent events are a little bit mixed. Certainly the accelerated regulatory approval is there. It's used for a lot of oncology products. It's certainly not going to go away. And, you know, there have been questions about how is it going to be used? When is it going to be used? What are the right criteria for saying, okay, we're going to grant you accelerated approval or not? Then come all of the questions, you know, more the operational parts behind it. Whereas we have these pathways, they exist, they do work, but even if you get designated, okay, accelerated approval, then the follow-up is the part that's been lacking, it's been struggling. You know, the FDA supposedly has not had good oversight over these programs to really make sure that companies are collecting the data that they're supposed to in the time frame and so on. And this leads also to a lack of trust, lack of faith in these kinds of approaches. So how we'll work together to make sure that this works properly, works better, you know, for pharma, for the regulators, for patients, I think we still have to work on. I think it's still, if you like, even after all these years, I think it's still a work in progress.
I totally agree, and I think that the innovation height on new treatments, especially in oncology or individualized genomic diagnostics, where it's really addressing an unmet need at the individual patient level rather than cohorts of patients, where we traditionally can have phase 2 and phase 3 trials randomized as we know them. Some of the new stem cell therapies actually demanding that we look at this in a very different light, because we will tailor treatments to an individual rather than a patient group, which means that the whole way of looking at evidence and the way we traditionally assess clinical value, we'll have to have a dialogue around that. So I think it's, and of course this is especially true in rare diseases. I think that's an incredibly fascinating point, because traditionally both regulatory systems and HTA agencies have a very set way in terms of looking at randomized clinical controlled trials. But this is something where we really need to co-develop together. And what I'm hoping personally is that we'll see a lot more partnerships between manufacturers and healthcare systems, and then regulators and payers, in order to address the value that new therapies for example, oncology are bringing. So I think that's a really fascinating area. And of course, in terms of the accelerated regulatory approval, I think we also see a lot of treatments being brought forward and I actually think we can learn something from the COVID situation, where vaccines were developed quite quickly. And I think we actually saw a mindset change where it's of course prove security and effect and efficacy on a treatment, but then being able to pull away and monitor while a new vaccine or a treatment are being used actively in a real world setting. And my hope is that we will learn a lot from that, so we can get new innovations quicker to patients while working at the highest safety environment possible. I think it's really a breakthrough then in the COVID situation.
Yeah.
Great, and of course, exactly how we're going to do that. I think Skip, you had an excellent discussion around the UK versus other countries, and that I think the UK is a very pragmatic system in terms of what kind of evidence is being accepted. And of course, the new updated NICE guidance on real-world evidence is likely to affect the field. How do you actually believe that we're going to see changes, and when do you expect us to see those changes?
I think you're talking to me.
Yeah, I mean,
go
ahead.
I have to say I'm over the moon about this new framework, and it's interesting when I talk to people around Europe, and the UK is the only place, and NICE is the only organisation that's looking at a framework for developing real-world evidence that will be accepted. And the thing is, as we all know, there's pressure for earlier access to promising new medicines, particularly in rare diseases where there may be a new alternative. The conflict always is that earlier access is likely to mean less data. So governments are anxious to keep patients happy with earlier access, but they're not necessarily happy to pay for these medicines because of the lack of data. Now, the Innovative Medicines Fund was launched recently by NHS England to support faster access to non-cancer drugs, and alongside the Cancer Drugs Fund will provide a total of £680 million ring-fenced NHS funding for innovative medicines, as some of these medicines may benefit from the recognition by NICE of the contribution that real-world evidence could make. However, with this framework, NICE is making two things very clear. The gold standard is still randomized controlled trials. And also, before starting to collect real-world data, companies need to understand what are the gaps in their existing evidence, so they know the questions they need answers to. Now, the best way of understanding what the gaps are, and therefore what those questions are, is through taking NICE scientific advice. So NICE scientific advice is very, very important. And the real-world evidence framework will identify when real-world data can be used to reduce uncertainties and improve guidance, and describe best practices for planning, conducting, and reporting. Those three: planning, conducting, and reporting real-world evidence studies to improve the quality and transparency of the evidence. NICE will also provide advice to companies planning, conducting those studies. So I will stop there, but this is very powerful indeed, and I think it's a great opportunity for companies.
Yeah, and I have a kind of almost like a mixed feeling about the NICE guidance. On the one hand, being an expert on real-world evidence, I don't see the innovation. I think it was almost a little bit of a letdown. But then I had to take a step back and say, okay, what is this really going to do to the field, especially considering that most people aren't experts in real-world evidence? okay? And most countries don't have a guidance on real-world evidence, and NICE has now come out with one. And they've done a really excellent job in laying out all the facets that Leslie just said. You know, it primarily is designed, you know, their use or their guidance is designed to improve transparency and quality. And it's to identify when NICE can use real-world evidence to reduce uncertainties and improve guidance. So again, they're going back also and saying, okay, right, the gold standard is randomized controlled trial. Great. If you're going to use real-world evidence, and like Leslie said, come to us early and talk about it, these are the key things that you need to keep in mind. And it all comes down, they summarized it in 3 points, you know, execute transparently and with integrity, use fit-for-purpose data, and address key risks of bias. And if you keep those 3 key points in mind, which they go through details, and they have all kinds of examples about previous rulings that they've made, you know, to exemplify all of these different assets. I think it's actually a really good, you know, source to say, this is how you do real-world evidence. This is the scientific rigor that you need to be thinking about when you're going to do real-world evidence. And I think this is what's been missing. It's always been considered a sort of a pseudoscience, and they're saying, no, the bar is being raised. It's not the gold standard of RCTs, but we're raising the bar and we're putting out a minimum, and you have to follow all the scientific, you know, rigor that you would for an RCT. You have to address the bias. You have to, of course, use fit-for-purpose data. You have to do the transparency. You have to have a statistical analysis plan, and so on. And all of these things are outlined very nicely and very concisely. So, and what's nice about NICE, I hate that, is that it's internationally recognized. So a lot of countries throughout the world will refer to things that NICE says. Okay, and they will refer to this NICE guidance on real-world evidence, and so I think it's hugely influential, and it puts out there this higher bar, this rigor that people should have in mind when they're doing real-world evidence, and also to sort of limit the expectations about what you could expect with real-world data. Primarily, you're not going to be able to replace a randomized controlled trial. There are lots of things, though, that you can do with it, and they give lots of examples, sort of case studies about what you can do with it. So I think the guidance is actually really useful, it's really timely, and will have immense influence across the globe.
If I have one question, it's going to be how committees, NICE committees, will, or what weight they will apply to real-world evidence in decision-making, and what guidance NICE will give the members of those committees to assess the real-world evidence. This is going to be new for them.
Yeah, and my hope is really that we will have that discussion early on, so we can collect the real-world evidence that addresses that uncertainty. So we actually, from UK patients, we have the answer to the uncertainty that will eventually be raised at a local level.
Yeah.
Excellent. I also want to make sure that any audience listening in have the opportunity to ask a question, and we are at that time where we can do that. So please, if you have a question, you can type it in into the chat form, and we will make sure to take your question.
Perhaps I could ask in the meantime, while that's happening, of my fellow speakers and chairman, regarding the reimbursement changes in Germany. Germany has been the #1 launch country in Europe. Are these changes likely to have an effect on that?
Do you want to go first, Skip?
No, I'll let you go first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I think it's actually a really valid question. And just to go back to the discussion before with the new real-world evidence guidance in the UK, I think it is a step forward. But it always concerns me when one country goes in a little bit different direction than other countries. And why does that concern me? Because it should really be a very interesting point. But the thing is that being a global manufacturer, we only have one development program, and our focus is really on creating the evidence that is needed in all markets. So if one market are becoming much more special than other markets, then we have to do things in a very different way. And of course that is fine, but we would really like things to be uniform and predictive, and drug development takes a long time, so we want to know it early. So when it comes to Germany, that's definitely a country that stands out. I think where the UK are a more pragmatic system in terms of what evidence is accepted and are very open to real-world evidence. I can think we see the opposite in Germany, where it is very clinically driven from the RCT design. And the new changes in Germany that is shortening the assessment period will definitely mean that it will be a tougher market to go into. It will be a greater risk for manufacturer to go into the German market. And of course, my advice for anyone wanting to do that is to take that early dialogue with German authorities, so there's full transparency around the expectations on evidence. But I think it is what we are seeing in Germany is concerning me, because it's making the market a greater risk, and the demands even higher to a market that was already very tough as a negotiator. And we have seen a lot of medicines that are launched in Germany, but then taking out of the markets. And these are medicines that are successful in the UK or other countries around the world. So there's definitely a need for them. So I think we have to find that balance. And I think I'm a bit worried about the German situation right now. Skip, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, from an evidence point of view, you're absolutely right. Development plans tend to be global in nature. And they're very long, they're very large, they're very expensive, and they only have a certain amount of flexibility. France usually wants comparator X, Germany wants comparator Y, UK wants comparator Z, the Nordics want comparator A. I'll start at the beginning. The US is, from a comparator point of view, perhaps less concerned. Oftentimes placebo-controlled are sufficient, at least from a regulatory point of view. So this makes it difficult to know, well, if I put in, comparator Y for Germany into at least one of my phase 3 randomized controlled trials, then I'll be satisfying Germany's needs, but not those of France and not those of the Nordics. So it becomes very difficult. If we look at the UK from a NICE point of view, some sort of indirect treatment comparison would be allowed. So it's a little bit more flexible when it comes to the evidence that's actually presented. Now, Germany, on the other hand, won't accept things coming from bottles, won't accept things coming from an indirect treatment comparison. This is why it makes Germany particularly difficult, in that everything for major decisions has to come from an RCT. This is why oftentimes we have other studies designed for the German market, oftentimes not on the main primary endpoint that we would have in the large regulatory phase 3 programs, but some other patient-relevant outcome. So dealing with Germany is awkward. It's difficult. We would rather take the modeling approach so we can have one uniform, consistent program that is truly, useful globally. But these are things that we have to take into account. So from an evidence point of view, it's a challenge.
And actually, one of the questions that we can raise here is that we're actually seeing some coming together on countries within the EU. They are now forming in the UNETA group to have one uniform assessment of the clinical added benefit. And of course, this will also then need to cater the needs of Germany and France and other countries within the EU. But UK will, of course, not be directly involved in this. So I think that's a really interesting situation that we are actually seeing some of this consensus forming across Europe. I don't know, Skip or Leslie, if you actually see this as a accelerator step or just another hurdle to overcome before patients can access new interventions.
How I see this is it's similar to enforcing or putting in place EU directives. Okay, the directive comes out, but each country has a certain time and certain flexibility about how they actually put it in place. And when it comes to these, relative effectiveness assessments that UNETA is going to do, and maybe I'm not as up to date on the topic as I should be, but my understanding is it's still not entirely clear what pressure or what lever UNETA actually has to make sure that each of the country's reimbursement bodies uses the results of the relative effectiveness assessments. My understanding is that they should take it as a recommendation, but they don't have to use it. And as long as that's still the case, then to an extent, it might accelerate things in a couple of countries, but to an extent, it's going to be viewed as an extra hurdle. And I think this is what in theory, it's wonderful, and I have been a big advocate of doing this and getting it going. But, then the question becomes, what will the individual countries really do with it? Maybe you have more up-to-date information. I'm not sure.
It's interesting. The question is, if we have a standard HTA approval, does that mean that we may end up with a standard price? And
this was just the assessment of the effectiveness, which is only one step in actually getting to the cost effectiveness, because then you have the country-specific costs and use and everything to take into account. So, yeah.
I'm thinking several years down the line.
Yeah, and as long as budgets are locally or nationally, then that will be the true hurdle, right? So I really hope that this new joint EU HTA platform of clinical added benefit really will pass the patient kind of perspective, that how will this actually accelerate access to new innovations. And I really hope that kind of thinking is going to be built into this new structure we're going to see. And of course, I hope that with in NICE, and I think it is really strong with this new real-world evidence guidance, that will also take the patient's perspective on how is this actually creating value, how is this getting new innovations faster to patients. And that's what I hope we're going to see, and I hope everybody will discuss that. So I know we are come to the end of the hour. Is there any final remarks? Thank you to my fellow speakers, presenters. I think it has been an excellent discussion on a very important topic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Olivia, do you have any final?
Yeah, thank you so much for passing that over, and thank you for that discussion. It was really interesting, super insightful discussion. So thank you, everyone. I'm afraid that is indeed all we have time for today. So we will address any of the other questions that we've received offline. If you do have any questions for Martin, Leslie, or Skip, then please feel free to send them to webinars@evb.com. Once again, just like to thank our wonderful chat and presenters, Martin, Leslie, and Skip, as well as you, of course, our listeners, for your time and questions today. If you'd like to let us know your thoughts on today's webinar, then please feel free to complete our feedback survey in the resource widget or tweet us at the EviBase. Also, don't forget to visit the evidence base at www.evidencebaseonline.com for more webinars. But that's it for today. Thank you again all for attending, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.